when I was in junior high school, one of the classes we had to take was home economics. We had to learn how to organize things in a house. How to set the table was one part. And so we learned that you put the fork on the left 1 inch away from the table, and then the plate in the middle, and then on the right hand side you have the knife and then the spoon. And that's how you eat, and that's the way it's done, and that's what's proper. Basically, you end up taking your fork in your right hand, even though you've placed it on the left. I don't understand why that was the way that it was done. And you eat your food. But that's just the way you're supposed to eat. And that's the way I thought you were supposed to eat. And then, when our oldest son was about 2 or 3 years old, he came in one day and he said, "Mama and Papa, one day I'm going to live in China. You can come visit me, but you're not going to live with me. I'm going to be a missionary and tell people about Jesus. And since I'm going to go to China, I have to know how to eat with chopsticks." And so our family took that as an opportunity to learn how to use chopsticks, because that's the way you eat when you're in China. A couple years after that, we moved to India. One day when I was in language school, I asked my teacher, what is the Urdu word for fork? And he looked at me and thought for a minute, and he held up his hand and he said, "Hot," because hot means hand, and you eat, you take the food and you just use your hand. You roll up a ball of rice, dip it in the sauce, and put it in your mouth. Well, while we were in India, we would often go to Southeast Asia and we would have meetings. And so we learned that the proper way to eat in Southeast Asia is you have a spoon in your, you have the spoon in your right hand and you have the fork in your left hand, and you use your fork kind of as a shovel or bulldozer to push the food onto your spoon, and you eat off of the spoon. Now, why am I talking about all of that in a class in church planting? Because today we're going to be looking at models of church planting, and the answer isn't to discover which is the right one. Should you use the fork in your right hand or your left hand? Should you use chopsticks or just eat with your hand? It all depends on where you are and what's appropriate for that situation. The same thing is true with these models of church planting. As you are going through and learning about different ways to start churches, the goal isn't that you pick the one right method to use every time. The goal is to determine what should you use in a particular instance. Watch these models and I'll see you at the other side. Today we're going to be starting a new week, a new study on models of church planting. Before we get too much further, I want to see how fast you can write. So I'd like for you, if you haven't already done so, to watch the brief video that I've linked to the course under the Moodle section on models for church planting, and I want to see how many methods of starting a church you can write down, because it goes pretty fast. When you're done, turn this back on and we'll go through another list, and hopefully we'll go through it slow enough that you can actually keep up. So, how many methods were you able to write down? How many other ways do you already know that new churches can get started? There is no generic best way to start. If you're wanting me to tell you the kind of church God wants you to plant, you're waiting for something I'm not going to give you. There are a lot of needs and there are a lot of approaches, and I'm a firm believer in the glory of variety as part of the way God created the universe. Here's a starter list of 10 different strategies that could be used to plant a new church. Some are better in some locations and some in others, so you'll just have to determine what God is wanting you to do in a particular setting. The first model I want to talk about is apostolic. Apostolic church planting is also known as pioneering or parachuting, or basically just starting from scratch. In this model, evangelism is maximized, but this type of church plant also requires a unique set of gifts that are often incompatible with those required of a pastor. Starting a church like this can happen anywhere the Spirit leads a person and will enable you to reach a new territory or a new people group. But churches started in this way may be slow to identify with the denomination because they don't have any prior link. They may be more expensive with a lower success rate if a denomination is funding a church planter in an area where he doesn't have any contacts. However, if the work is lay-led at first through Bible studies and developing relationships, a church planter is not called or supported until a core group is formed, those issues can be avoided, and this can be the most effective way to start a church in an area where people are not already aware of the gospel. Similar to the apostolic method is the catalytic church planter. This uses the same basic concepts as an apostolic church plant. Someone with an apostolic gift is sent to start multiple churches at the same time. He can train leaders as they emerge in the new congregations to allow multiplication to continue. This is frequently what is done on the international mission field, but it also has a place in North America. We used this strategy, for example, in North Carolina when we were trying to start multiple churches among the 50,000 Spanish speakers living in a county. Rather than trying to find and fund a church planter to start 100 different churches, we thought we would get one catalytic church planter to come in and start a church planting movement, training up leadership from within and allowing the churches to be lay-led. So that can be a very effective way to spread the gospel widely in an area where you have a lot of people who need to hear about Jesus and you don't have a lot of resources in terms of existing churches or outside funds. Team migration is also known as hiving off, or getting a core group of people from a sponsor church to go out and start a new church. This is a very popular way to start new churches where the church is already strongly established. It's of course unusual in pioneer work areas. Churches that teach tithing might want to consider tithing their membership. The strengths of this method include financial stability and trained leadership with a heart for church starting from day one. A weakness, of course, could be the lack of a motivation for evangelism and an emphasis on taking members from existing churches rather than reaching the lost. Lately, it's become popular for churches to start this way, not just across town, but across great distances. We were members of a church at one time that sent core teams to Orlando, Florida, and to Las Vegas, Nevada. Active church members moved their families, found new jobs, and invested in new communities so that they could help a new plant after spending a year getting training and building relationships with others on their core team. Multi-site churches, also known as satellite church planting, is when the mother church staff continues to hold the reins on a new start. Rather than technically being a new church plant, it is really the same church meeting in multiple locations. In some cases, each campus has a campus pastor who does the preaching. In others, the pastor's message is broadcast from the main campus. I've even heard of churches that have created a 3D holographic projection of the pastor at the satellite campus. A danger of this style, of course, is that it can become personality-driven. When the pastor leaves, the network can easily collapse. Also, it may discourage the development of new leaders since everything remains under the control of the home base. And, of course, it is very, very financially costly. It takes a lot of money to run an organization like that. Multi-congregational churches refers to a large church with good facilities that opens up their facility to offer space and guidance to multiple new starts, often from other ethnic communities. Gretchen and I once did a training in a church in Burbank, California that had 6 different language congregations meeting in their building every week. Of course, in a model like this, care must be given to prevent tensions arising between the different communities. Constant, clear communication is vital. But when done well, this type of church can literally be a piece of heaven on earth. Cell church or cell group church is built on the premise that all Christians are ministers and that the work of the ministry should be performed by all Christians. The life of the church occurs in small group meetings, 8 to 12. The cells gather periodically for large gatherings called celebrations, and so sometimes this method is called the cell celebration model. Ralph Neighbor, who wrote the Survival Kit, a popular follow-up program many years ago, is an outspoken advocate of this method. A cell group church is organized in this way. The senior pastor supervises the cell group leaders who are the spiritual leaders for their cell groups. The cell groups typically have 8 to 15 members and they meet weekly. They meet for celebratory worship, all of the different cell groups, periodically, sometimes weekly, sometimes monthly. The senior pastor's primary ministry is to the cell group leaders, and within each cell group, they find a place for prayer, fellowship, Bible study, and pastoral care rather than having the staff be responsible for those things. The biggest advantage to a cell group church is that one trained pastor can expand his ministry. If you have a shortage of trained pastors, it can be a helpful model since the cells can multiply indefinitely. The Yoido Full Gospel Church in Seoul, Korea, for example, grew to 800,000 members using this model. Similarly, this can be a useful model in urban settings where traditional church with land and building is just not financially feasible. While unusual in North America, it will require a lot of selling, but it's been very effective in reaching urban areas around the globe. There aren't a lot of successful models of cell churches in rural areas, however. closely related to the cell church is the house church. They're very similar, except it would be like a cell church that never got around to having the celebration time. Each house church has its own pastor, while a cell church has one pastor that supervises many different cell groups. In a house church, it's often associated with areas under persecution like China or Algeria, the Islamic world, even the early Roman Empire, so we learn a lot about it in the New Testament. It's starting to gain popularity in North America. One plus of the house church movement is that they are economically efficient. Up to 90% of the income can be spent on evangelism, missions, and ministry because there's no paid staff and no building or overhead. Other advantages come from having deeper discipleship making opportunity, flexibility in programming, and it's less intimidating for newcomers who maybe wouldn't want to go into a church building but would be very comfortable coming into someone's home. On the other hand, a difficulty is that they almost always lack experienced leadership. Cultural preconceptions can give people a negative feeling about the work and maybe even consider that it's a cult. Sometimes they become ingrown and resistant to change. Multi-housing communities are ways to start churches in apartment buildings or gated communities or trailer park communities, places where people live in high concentration and not in individual houses. Over 95% of the people living in multi-housing are missed by traditional churches. Multi-housing ministry brings the church to the people, meeting in an apartment or a trailer or a community room on site, not asking the people to leave that community to engage a church, but to have the church there on that facility. Of course, the expenses are going to be lower. The challenge is getting permission from the management to be able to come in and to start a church on their property. Often, though, managers will see the value of having community develop because that helps maintain tenants and makes their job much easier. Church revitalization is the process of bringing new life to a dead or dying congregation, and there are multiple models within this one concept: redream, adoption, merge, or replant. Redream is when an outside expert comes in to help the church explore ways they can be brought back to their core reason for being the church and help them develop a new plan for reaching their community. Often that community will be very different from their original congregation ethnically and culturally. Sadly, this process almost always means the removal of the current pastor and church leadership. Adoption is when a healthy, growing church takes over the struggling church for growth and mutual benefit. The staff of the adopting church can provide resources, financial, strategic, and human, to reinvigorate the congregation. Merging is when two struggling churches join together to pool their resources. If there's a willingness to change and reach out, this can be a good strategy, but if two unhealthy churches merge, you just have a bigger, unhealthy church that will continue to be ineffective. Replanting, often this means the facilities that are already available for a new congregation have been left as an inheritance from a church that has died. The community will have a perception of that church that has either never gotten their attention or worse, turned them off. So the new church will have to be very intentional about creating a new buzz about who they are and what they exist to do. Final model is the church split. Church planting expert Bob Logan says splits are often unplanned pregnancies. A split indicates the church needed to start a new work anyway, but did not. When this happens, everyone needs to work and pray for restoration of relationships so that the root of bitterness is not given room to grow. So, how would you go about deciding which church planting model you want to use in your new church start? Well, there are a couple of factors that you want to keep in mind. First of all, of course, is the biblical principles. What does the Bible tell you about what a church is and how a church should be established? What ethical values do you want to maintain as you go into this church plant? Are there indigenous principles? The people that you are trying to reach with the gospel, are they more likely to respond to one model or another? Keep that in mind. Financial resources. What do you have the ability to pay for? Mass media. How can you communicate your presence and get the word out? What is the educational level of your target group, and what is that going to make them more likely to respond to in terms of a form of outreach? Are there culture and worldview realities in this target group that would say large group, small group is more important to them, being in a particular building or meeting in a home is more comfortable for them? Are there political and legal realities that have to be concerned? In many countries, it's illegal to build a church structure, so the only option is to have a house church. What is the existing pattern of work? What is demonstrating fruitfulness in the community where you want to plant a church? What are your available human resources? You can't really start a hive church if you don't have a group of people willing to come and join you. So thinking through what is available to you. What are the spiritual gifts of the church planter? What are going to be his strengths, and how can he build a team that will help him use them most effectively? And then what is the phase-out factor? Is the church planter coming in to start a church that he really wants to pastor, or is he looking at multiplication and maintaining an apostolic role? With that in mind, you'll be in a position to begin to develop an end vision for how to start your church. The end vision is your concept of what the new church or churches will be like when established. And when you know what that is like, then you're going to be much more effective in your work. There are many reasons to develop this end vision. It will help sharpen focus. It will help you recruit team members. It will help you clarify the goals of the church and know what kind of church you're trying to start. Helps you to know what to advertise, what to share with the community, and what it is you need to find in order to be effective in your ministry. So how would you go about that? How would you begin to develop an end vision? Certainly you'd want to pray for guidance and study the Bible. You'd also want to consult with some wise counselor who would be able to give you insight and advice based on their experience. You'd want to consider the focus group that you're trying to reach in the community in which they live. Begin to develop a team, as we've talked about, that can help you know what necessarily needs to be done. And then put together a vision statement so you can communicate clearly to others the type of church that you're trying to start. Other factors involved in this end vision that you would want to include are your biblical convictions about the nature of the church, the role of the Holy Spirit in what you're doing, the financial realities that you face, the worldview issues of the people you're trying to reach, as well as any cultural considerations, the available personnel to work with you, again, the church planter's gifts and talents, and the community situation. I'm going to end today's session with a 10-minute video, and it is a video celebrating the 5th anniversary of a church that was started in Greensboro, North Carolina not too long ago. And through this video, you're going to hear many of the things that we've talked about, what their vision was, how it was developed, the model of church that they felt was appropriate for them to pursue. I want you to consider all of that as well as the other things that we've discussed in this course to this point, and try to put together as much as you can a behind-the-scenes look from this video. What are the aspects of how the church was planted that you see illustrated? What are some of the strengths that you see in their model? And what are some concerns you have about the future growth of this church? I'll have a place for you to respond to that on the forum. And then the rest of this week, as we continue to look at models, I'm going to give you an opportunity to explore what the North American Mission Board has been doing in church planting, and also some of the models that are being used by the International Mission Board through the No Place Left movement, and how that's begun to influence the work being done here in America today. Hope this will be helpful for you as you consider the strategies that God may want you to use. And as always, I'm available if you have any questions or concerns. I'd love to hear from you. God bless.
I just want us to sit and to think about what God might do through Mercy Hill Church. Because what I think we see is that as we plant Mercy Hill Church, as people come to Christ, as people are baptized, as believers are given the gospel and fueled for mission and sent out to be missionaries to the city of Greensboro, it will spread like wildfire and it will be contagious in this city. I am believing a lot of things for Mercy Hill Church. I believe outrageous things for Mercy Hill Church.
You know, you drive around to most towns in North Carolina, it feels like there's a church on every corner, but the statistics would say that the growth of churches not nearly keeping up with the growth of the population. In fact, churches are dying in the South faster than churches are dying anywhere else in the United States. So that was very much a reason to want to plant a church in the South.
Church planting is super glamorous at that time. I mean, it was very, and not even now, I mean, people at conferences and all this kind of stuff, but we saw that it was not a cakewalk with a lot of members from our team. I mean, I feel like the year before we planted Mercy Hill, probably the hardest I'd ever run in my life. And man, I felt like the weight of the world was on us, but the Lord still had our team, and he was doing something that was far beyond what we were doing. I think about our launch team and how many of them sacrifice in just incredible ways.
I had to leave behind family and a life that I'd known for, 10, 15 years.
I wasn't really sure what I was going to do. Of course, we're trying to figure out, okay, what does that mean for my wife and her job? We have a 1-year-old little girl.
I ended up selling my house and quitting my job. It also was over a 50% pay cut.
We were sort of moving with the potential of me just having a part-time job, her potentially having no job.
I moved in May and did not have a job, and I had to commute to Greensboro 4 days a week for 3 months.
We moved out here and didn't really have a job yet.
We just kind of said, hey, God, look, we feel like you're leading us in this direction. As we've talked to other people, as we've prayed through this fervently, we feel like this is where you're leading us, and so we're just going to trust you.
Jeremy Dager, he started his own painting company and needed some help, and so him and I painted houses. It was an adventure. It was an adventure, for sure.
We started thinking about like where we were going to meet. We landed on Burr Mill Park.
I remember me and Bobby driving around. It was the only place we could afford because it was so cheap. But we thought about the fact that nobody knows where this is. It's not by anything. It's 30 minutes from any campus.
It's always funny because when you tell them you meet at Burr Mill Park, it's like, do you meet outside? Or is this like, people like out there just like circling up, holding hands in the grass, like singing? Like, what do you mean you meet in a park?
Just like, I don't know, it just seems like about the worst place in the world to try to launch a church, but that was all we had at that time.
I mean, here we are meeting at Burr Mill Park in North Greensboro, and all of a sudden 6 to 8 High Point University students show up, and we were all kind of dumbfounded a little bit. First off, how did you hear about Mercy Hill? Second, how long did it take you to get here? It took them probably a good 45 minutes, 50 minutes just to get to Burr Mill Park.
As we began to talk to some of those people, come to find out God had been like working in their lives apart from Mercy Hill, not through Mercy Hill, through other people, other churches, other means. And Mercy Hill sort of got to come in on the back end of that. We keep gathering together in communion, preaching the gospel, and God just keeps adding to our number.
What a church plant truly is what you see take place in the New Testament. You see these churches. They're being planted, they're being watered, and they're being grown by God.
The gospel being on display every week was truly the thing that God has used to bring about life change.
People in the South are sort of in many ways inoculated to the gospel. They've sort of gotten the vaccine to where they know just enough of the gospel to think they have it, but many times they don't. They just have religion, which is sort of opposed to the gospel.
I mean, when I think of kind of how we were living, I would definitely say it was very kind of religious based. It was certainly like, all right, this is what you do, this is how you live, you go to church on Sundays. I think God transformed our minds to see that no, the gospel impacts everything. It impacts your career, it impacts your pursuit in your daily lives with relationships with others.
It definitely has changed every aspect of our life.
To see people really broken free from the bondage of works-based salvation and really broken free into freedom, it's been amazing. And story after story.
People who, they said, I've been in church my whole life, and whatever this gospel is that you're talking about, I've been missing it, and almost either reawakening, or for some, really feeling like, I don't think I'm a Christian, and placing their faith in Christ, and this weight being lifted off of their shoulders.
I just think about God dropping in hints of my hand is still on you, my hand is still on you, all the way through breaking 1,000 people on our second birthday, something we prayed for like crazy.
Very distinctly, I just remember standing outside and just watching people come, and more people were coming, and more people were coming, and just thinking, what is going on, And by the end of the day, realizing, we had over 1,000 people here. Our 2-year birthday, over 1,000 people here. It was a day like that where I feel like I caught a glimpse And I realized, like, I think this is what you would call a movement of God.
Thinking back to the goals that we had set out and just prayed to see God do and move was 35 groups, having around 500 people in attendance at Mercy Hill. And when we looked at that a couple of years ago, it's like he's already blown that out of the water. And just really, as we prayed Ephesians 3:20, God has just exceeded everything that we could have asked or imagined.
Seeing the financial campaigns for that upfit at Regional, to launch Clifton Road, go multi-site on our 4th birthday, to see 500 baptisms in 5 years at Mercy Hill. Just unbelievable. Things that we couldn't have really even imagined.
At one time that we baptized like over 70 some odd people in like a day, that was amazing. We wasn't pulling strings. It was our church just sharing the faith with people. And I think it was God bringing about true life change to the point where people wanted to confess Him as Lord.
The most encouraging thing is not high attendance numbers, it's life change, and people walking from death to life.
And getting to experience that firsthand in our community groups. And not just seeing the numbers flash on the screen, but seeing like, hey, I know this person who came to know the Lord this year. And I know that he's walking with God because I see him every week.
When the church started and it was just like 50 pretty much white, mid-20s people. And now we have, grandparents and great-grandparents, and we have high schoolers, and, we have Asians, and we have Black kids, and just so much. And so I just would pray for that to increase. We really point to the glory and the value of God when there's diversity in the people who are worshiping Him.
There is such a hunger for the gospel and such a hunger for community. And so there's an insatiable desire in us not to just grow so we can say, hey, look at us, right, but because there's lostness of bounds. What if for these years that God has given us, what if we just ran after that as hard as we possibly could and said, we will do something about it for the sake of God's glory.
There's 1 million people in the triad. Like, I praise God for what He's done. Mm-hmm. And it's not a small thing, but there's 1 million people in the triad, and we have so much to do.
The tendency for me is to look at what God has done at Mercy Hill and to want to settle. But I think that's selling our mighty God short.
Well, as it turns out, after showing you all of that silverware, I'm really just getting ready to have some cornflakes, and so all I need is a little spoon. I'm going to enjoy my breakfast. You enjoy the rest of your day. God bless.